This woman's story really, I think, highlights and reveals the story really of each and every one of us. That's one of the beauties of the Gospel of John. If you ever read all four of the Gospels in succession, certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a certain parallel approach. We call them the synoptics because there's something that we can see many times, similar stories. But John's stands out in a very particular way as very, very distinct from the others. And I think that's partially because John was the last one written. John had the most time to really contemplate in a deeper way, maybe than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on all the beautiful interactions that Jesus had throughout his time. And so he highlights some of these very, very important ones that are there. And I think under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he wants you and me to see in each of these interactions that Jesus has, even our own story. And this powerful encounter with Jesus, with the woman at the well, becomes one I think that we can draw a lot from ourselves. So to begin to kind of understand this, I think we have to start at the deepest desires within our own heart as human beings. If I were to ask you to write down what is something that every single human being wants, from the very beginning of humanity to today, what's something that really every single person, if they really think about it, truly, honestly desires? You know, initially our minds might go, well, people want money, people want power, people want a Stanley Cup championship. At least this guy does. you know. But if we really pause and think about it, we have to go a little bit deeper because we know people who don't want those types of things. And one of the answers, and perhaps the truest of answers, I would perhaps argue, is everybody wants to be loved. When we really think about it, just about everything that we do, every pursuit that we have is somehow related to that desire to be loved. It's something that seems like it's put within us that crosses all boundaries and all times and spaces. And it's something that we didn't even really put there ourselves. And yet, we desire it. You think of from the very beginnings of life, little babies are constantly reaching out to their parents in this desire to be held, to be comforted. As they get older too, little children start performing things, and what do they always want? To be seen. Look at me, behold me. It's this instinct that is so important, and perhaps even more important than the act itself. Just simply watch me, Mom and Dad. When we become teenagers, while it might not be our parents' affection that we're seeking, we seek it to be loved by our friends, by those around us. I feel bad for the times that my mom tried to give me a hug in public while I was in middle school. But certainly I was looking for the admiration from my friends and for those who would simply think that I'm amazing. We go as well and we go to college in those ways too, and we're seeking many times in our times at university or after high school to find our place where there's people who will enjoy us, our presence, who will accept us, who we can have a fun time with. Even as we go into our careers and those, we certainly want the admiration and the approval, and to some extent the love of those who employed us. We want to make sure we look good to those whom we're working with. And even one of the scariest things to think about in the future that we often hear about is somebody dying alone. Even there, as we reach the twilight of our times in life, we desire somebody to be with us. Each and every human really has this call and this desire to be loved. And so as a result, we try to seek this out. And this is where this woman at the well, her story comes into play. Here she is at the noon of the day, and she comes to this well to draw water. And it's right there in this simple, natural desire of her own heart, her own body. She thirsts where Jesus is going to meet her. In this natural inclination just for biological water, something she didn't put in herself, it's right there where Jesus wants to meet her and reveal the truths of who he is and the truths of who she is. And so they begin their brief little conversation that's there. And quickly the woman begins to recognize that Jesus is not only talking about physical water, but he knows that's where it has to start. And so he looks to her and he simply says, "Give me a drink." And thus begins this engagement. First, she's shocked that he would even seek her out. She says, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" And even John, knowing that we might struggle in the future, says Jews and Samaritans hold nothing in common. There was a centuries-long tension between these two groups, to the point where many times the Jews, to even traverse, would go out of their way to avoid the Samaritan areas. But now here he is, cutting right through the Samaritan area. He stops, his apostles have gone off to get some food, and there he is alone, and he engages in a discussion with her. And even there's a curious detail that John puts in. It was noon. In the hot, arid areas where this engagement happened, it would not be common for somebody to go at noon in the heat of the day. But rather, you would go in the morning before the sun got up, or you go late at night. And so here's this woman who has to come in the middle of the day. Why? Tradition holds it's because she was a woman of the night, and she was despised by the other women and highly not accepted, living an immoral life. And so the only time she could come was even in the most uncomfortable. So here she is, a Samaritan, a woman, and many times the cultural tensions between men and women, and even the way she chooses to live her life is one that no Messiah by human ideas would possibly talk with her. But he does. And he engages her in this beautiful conversation. And she talks about coming back to this well over and over and over again. A parallel and an idea and a symbol of even our struggle, our desire to be loved. In how many different ways do we try throughout our lives to fulfill that desire to be loved? How many different pursuits, how many different efforts do we make? I think of myself back in, especially middle school. Boy, those were tough years. Thinking about, having to worry. I went to public school, so I had to worry about what I was going to wear every day. Trying to think, okay, are they going to think that this looks good? Are they going to make fun of me? Now, of course, as a priest, I don't even get to pick. But you think, too, even in our modern day, in the social media realm that many of us do operate in, we post the pictures, and then quickly we're wondering, how many likes is it going to get? When I was teaching in the high school, hearing these kids share with me in their rather vulnerable moments that they would post something, and if it didn't get enough likes by lunch, you delete it. Why? Because it's that pursuit to be loved. How many different times in our lives have we changed maybe our appearance, maybe our way of talking, what we were interested in, all so that somebody would give us approval? And this woman, too, as we know in the longer version of the story for herself, Jesus reveals that she had actually not been married once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, but in fact she had been married 5 times. And even the man that she was living with at that time was not her husband. As we hear her reveal that part of her story, there's a piece of our heart that should break for her, that should be sad. Here's this woman seeking to be loved, and 5 times she sought it out in marriage, and 5 times it ended in divorce. And so understandably, there's this sadness that's there. And it's in that sadness, too, where Jesus wants to meet her, wants to reveal his heart, his love for her. And so in this time, too, Jesus wants to meet us in our own pursuit of love and being loved. As we have those longings and those desires in our own hearts, There's a temptation to think that it's going to be found in this world. And so we pursue, we try, we put all of our energies, our efforts, we spend money, we spend time, we spend nights worrying. Sometimes we're even tempted to despair. Is it even possible? And it's in those moments, too, where we can even feel exposed. Because Jesus wants to meet us in our own desire to be loved. If you've ever had that desire to be loved, that's exactly where Jesus wants to meet you. And so Jesus wants to shine a light on that desire in your heart and in mine. And initially, that's a scary thing because we feel exposed. Because we may have to admit to Jesus all the ways, perhaps even immoral ways, that we have tried to fulfill that desire to be loved. And that's a scary place to be. I know when I stand before the Lord and I really expose my heart to Him, I see ugliness. I see my own sin. I see the times where I, even as a priest, have fallen off from the path and have tried to seek love and affirmation in so many different ways that aren't going to actually fulfill me. And same thing, too, with this woman. When Jesus reveals her past, she, too, is afraid. And she does exactly what I like to do when Jesus reveals my own shortcomings to me. She changes the subject. She begins to talk then about how worship is going to happen. But Jesus, loving her way, way too much, knowing her longings, knowing that He Himself as the Creator planted that seed in her heart of that desire to be loved, wants to show her and reveal to her that He, in fact, is the fulfillment of that desire. And notice how she reveals that she does have a little bit of hope. She reveals in her conversation this little statement that we can't miss. She says, "I know that the Messiah is coming." I know that the Messiah is coming. In her heart, she has discovered that still exists, despite all of her failed attempts to be loved fully and completely, she still has hope. She discovers in her own heart this spark, this little bit of a spark, that possibly there is one who can fulfill her desire to be loved forever. And she doesn't even seem to know where that comes from. In a certain sense, given what we know about her, she should be a woman of despair, thinking that I'm not even going to find love in the greatest of things that we have as humans, of marriage. And I've tried it 5 times. In theory, she should be a woman of despair. But yet, she has hope. And we may even discover in ourselves, when we're feeling at our lowest, our most unlovable, even by ourselves, that there's still this odd spark that we didn't place in our own hearts of a hope that maybe my desire to be loved eternally can be fulfilled. That's the great virtue, the theological virtue of hope. For you remember the 3 virtues, faith, hope, and charity, sometimes translated love. We call those theological virtues, not natural virtues. Natural virtues are those that we can grow in ourselves, that through discipline we can grow. But there's these 3 that God Himself has to give to us. And as we heard in that second reading, Paul says we have hope because the love of God has been poured into us, has been granted to us. And so this woman finds that little brief glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this desire I've had from the very beginning of my existence to be loved can be fulfilled. And then it's right in that moment, I can only picture how much Jesus must have been smiling, absolutely smiling with glee and delight to look at her and say, "I am He. I am the one who's going to fulfill that." I'm sure in that moment, the woman's heart must have leapt with such joy, but fear, doubts and questionings. But she didn't give in to that. Instead, she becomes one who receives that and allows herself to believe it. To the point where she now runs into that town that has rejected her so soundly. And she goes and tells everyone, here he is. By her action there, look at how Jesus' love helped her overcome all those fears that she was willing to go into that town. Why could she step into the dark and dangerous areas of life of going into that town so publicly? Because she knew she was loved. So for ourselves too, in this Lenten time, where are we on this journey? Where do we find ourselves as we hear the woman at the well and her encounter with Jesus? And what you'll discover if you've pursued the Christian life at any point, this is not a linear progression. I wish I could say, go through this experience one time, and by 20 you'll be set and you'll perfectly live in the love of Christ each and every moment of your day. Sadly, that's not the case for us, for me or for anyone else. We end up progressing, we end up sinning, we end up falling short, we end up distancing ourselves from that love. So Lent becomes this time for us to put away other things, other joys, other good things in this world that do give us affirmation. We set them aside because we know we were not made for the affirmations and the love of this world alone. But in fact, that longing in your heart for eternal love is something that only God can fulfill. So let us make sure that each and every day of our lives, we turn to the one who gives that life-giving water so that we may never thirst again, because it is only in Jesus Christ where our fulfillment to be loved, where our desire to be loved will be fulfilled.